America needs to hear from the UK and its other very strong allies. It needs to hear that perspective, especially, I think, from our European allies, because when I was in Ukraine, it just became so much more real to me that the battle could spill out into the rest of Europe. And because of our proximity in the US, I don't think that Americans really, they don't see it from your perspective. And so I hope David Cameron comes and is able to lay that out on the floor for all of his meetings. We don't know a lot, but I think that it's sending a very strong message that he's committed to reaching out to both sides. And I think that it shows that he knows where the target audience is. And he knows that he has to get Donald Trump on board with Ukraine funding. And that's quite a task.
I mean, one can assume that Trump knows who David Cameron is, even although David Cameron previously in his memoirs has been pretty rude about him, calling him protectionist, xenophobic and misogynistic.
Right. I mean, it's a tough sell. I was honestly, I was a little bit surprised to see that Trump had agreed to a meeting. I mean, David Cameron really wants to meet with the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, and that's really unclear at this point. So I think the fact that Trump accepted an invitation to speak with David Cameron goes a long way.
What is Trump's position about supporting Ukraine? Is he saying absolutely we won't send any more money or arms?
No, it's very murky what about his position on Ukraine. He certainly leans away from wanting to support continued funding. He has been behind, calling Republican congressmen behind the scenes, trying to break up this $60 billion bill that would provide $60 billion for Ukraine. So he has been, he's all over the map, really. But I think we should just watch for the narratives that come out of this meeting. I think this could be a really critical point that we see a breakthrough in Donald Trump's position on Ukraine.
Because a lot of people in Europe agree with David Cameron that this is existential, basically that if Russia were to prevail in its attack on Ukraine, it would be the beginning of World War III.
Mm-hmm.
Do Americans see it that way?
I just went to Ukraine last month. I spent 3 weeks embedded with the military there, and I did it because there's such a reduction in media coverage of what's happening in Ukraine. And I think that does affect the American public if they're not seeing it as regularly as they were when there was a lot of support. The sentiment kind of fades. But you talk to everyday Americans, and I think everyone leans towards supporting Ukraine, the majority of people, but there's just a lowering interest in it, especially since the conflict in the Middle East erupted.
Now, what about the other meetings that David Cameron's going to have? He's, we understand, going to see the House Speaker, Mike Johnson. What is the chance of swinging the Republicans, enough Republicans, to support the aid package for Ukraine?
I think we have to see whether or not Mike Johnson actually accepts that invitation to speak. I know that that's kind of the main point driving Lord Cameron here, but I'm not sure that he has actually accepted that invitation. I think that he can be effective if he does go and speak to Mike Johnson. I think it's interesting, though, that he's going before any scheduled meeting with the House Speaker. He's actually going to meet with, Antony Blinken, his counterpart in the U.S. first thing tomorrow morning. He's going to meet with the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and then the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. All of those people are pro Ukraine funding, and so he's going to take all of those meetings and then hopefully bring that together to pitch to Mike Johnson that he needs to allow the House to vote on this bill.
In the meeting with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, likely, do you think that the Middle East and Israel will predominate, because they pretty much agree on Ukraine, don't they?
They do agree on Ukraine. I think there can be some insight provided in a number of these meetings. Maybe not Antony Blinken, but certainly Mitch McConnell, who can speak about the Republican psyche and what's kind of driving a hesitance to put this bill on the floor. I think getting into the mindset of Ukraine is going to be important. And Israel will also come up. There's been a lot of developments this week, and I'm sure they're going to discuss that. A lot of their viewpoints, though, to your point, they align on.
And we had yesterday the apparent withdrawal of IDF forces from some parts of Gaza, but at the same time, Netanyahu defiantly saying that he'd set a date for the next assault, the assault which the American administration had warned him against. I mean, are we approaching a point, do you think, where if Netanyahu carries on as he has been, that there could be some sort of breach with Israel? Because we know in previous conflicts, America has actually stopped supplying weapons briefly to Israel.
I think what really made a big difference in that shift was the killing of the World Central Kitchen employees. They were the humanitarian aid workers there, and one person killed was an American. That really woke up the Biden administration, and I was told that they were really infuriated by that. And taking that perspective, I suspect that the needle is moving towards putting Netanyahu in check.
British public opinion is firmly supporting a ceasefire. Where's American public opinion on this?
It's still very scattered, but the protests to end the bombings in Gaza are everywhere. Especially, living in Washington, D.C., I see something about daily, either a protest or someone tagging a wall that says "Free Gaza." Palestinian and Muslim Americans are hurt and they are protesting all the time. But then I think there's a lot of people out there who aren't paying as close attention, but still, the American public is waking up to the atrocities that are happening in Gaza. It's hard, though, for them because we've always had Israel as such a strong alliance.
And finally, difficult question, really, but I mean, what does America think of David Cameron? Obviously, he was on the international stage as British Prime Minister for 7 years, but
Yeah.
does anyone know who he is? What are the memories of him?
I mean, his association with Brexit really made him not quite a household name, but definitely put him on the map. The U.S., I think his presence will be appreciated more than perhaps the person who was minister before him because of his national recognition and his long history of negotiating and planning and America needs to hear from the UK and its other very strong allies. It needs to hear that perspective, especially I think from our European allies, because when I was in Ukraine, it just became so much more real to me that the battle could spill out into the rest of Europe. And because of our proximity in the US, I don't think that the Americans really, they don't see it from your perspective. And so I hope David Cameron comes and is able to lay that out on the floor for all of his meetings.
But it's interesting. You think he's sort of increased the credibility of British diplomacy in America?
I think so. Yeah, I do think so. Because he is a figure that people recognize. I mean, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I think people know who Rishi Sunak is, but I think more people know who David Cameron is.